Hey, and welcome to the Growing Leaders Podcast.
Welcome back.
Yeah, welcome back. This podcast exists because the topic of growing next generation leaders is super important. Welcome back, Jamie.
Yeah, welcome. So this is interesting because we are recording this podcast during your maternity leave and during my vacation.
Yeah.
It's supposed to be pretty important today. So first of all, for everybody out there, the last time that they saw you, you were great with child, pregnant with purpose and joy, and now you're not. So what happened?
Well, I still do have a child. He's just out of utero.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, so you should introduce him on the podcast.
I don't have him with me today, but I can
No,
bring him next
but I mean,
time.
like, say something.
His name is Mateo Rafael Emmet, and he is really cool, and he is a miracle.
Yeah, he is. And if you guys get a chance, probably when we do the conference recap, we'll put in a little bit of Pete and Christine kind of shared the testimony of the miracle of Mateo. So you'll get a chance to hear it. But for now, it remains a mystery. But today, Christine, the thing that would draw us both out of our slumber and our life of recreation
is that we love podcasting so much.
Yeah, just we missed each other. I know. Kathy was just saying that I missed you. So you probably were like, thank God I don't have to do a podcast. But we got you in here. But today, actually, the content is really, really important. This episode is one of the ones that we're finding to be one of the game changers. So to make the great reveal, what we're talking about today is the power of superheroic teams alongside churches. And we've been talking since the beginning of this podcast about the fact that for churches, it's not going to work doing it the way we've been doing it. And so that for sure is out there, which can sound a little hopeless. We shifted just a little bit, or we added to that content along the way, saying what we are finding out there is about 30 to 40% of churches are encountering some secrets that are the game changers that are allowing them to make the jump over to what is working. And the reason that this content or this episode is so important is that this is one of those things that forever we've wanted to say church is supremely important. And that is so true. There is no other plan but the church. The church is the people who respond to Jesus by faith, and they're a really, really, really big deal. It is so true. And so that's a theological point that has in some ways been our foundation and is true, but it also has gotten in the way of some other truth, which is that the kingdom of God was actually Jesus's message. It was, seek first the kingdom, is Matthew 6:33. And Jesus comes with the gospel of the kingdom, not of the church. And his basic point is that the kingdom of God is the central piece that you have to understand. It's the most important thing, and everything revolves around it, including, this is our big point of today, including the church. And actually, the beauty of the church is the church are all of those individuals who, by faith, have accepted Jesus' invitation to orbit around the kingdom. That's what it is. But what happens sometimes when you stress the importance of something is you end up hearing church, 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 church. And it's kind of like the kid in Sunday school who they are asking all these questions and the answer is Jesus. And finally they say, what's a bushy-tailed little animal with little eyes that, eats nuts and acorns? And he says, yeah, I know the answer is Jesus because I've been in the Sunday school long enough, but it sure sounds like a squirrel. But for most of us, we feel like the answer to everything is church. And that's actually really, really hurt us. It's put churches in a place where they miss the humility, they miss the meekness, and they miss the power of what Jesus encountered as the suffering servant. And so what happens is we've started to see churches taking on dynamics that are more worldly, power brokers, self-centered, self-referential, self-absorbed, which Jesus was none of those things. So the body of Christ becomes nothing like Christ himself. And that's where church all of a sudden isn't orbiting around the kingdom, and it actually becomes not even the church. And so one of the things that we're talking about today is that there's some other kingdom structures. Namely, one of the things that you see in the early church are these missionary bands, these outreach teams like Paul and Jesus, that were kingdom structures alongside churches that rotated around the kingdom and made churches so much more powerful. So that's the basic premise, but that's a lot of stuff. But what does that make you think, Christine?
I am really excited about the conversation. I think I don't want to say it's like revolutionary because it's really just, it's something that's happened before that we kind of forgot. Some of the missionary bands you're just talking about, like that's like Paul the Apostles, and it's not that we're trying something new. It's actually we're talking about something that's actually how it all started, and it's going back to the basics. Like it's true going back to the basics. But basically what you just said, it's seek first the kingdom, not seek first the church. And so in my mind, it's almost like the subtitle of like today's episode, where it's like, it's not that the church is bad, but the church isn't what we're supposed to be seeking. Yeah. The church is it's a body, it's a gathering place of people, but it's not the end all be all. The end all be all is Jesus, and is the kingdom of God. And so I think it's a really important conversation to be reframed, and to be had not just by us, but like as we continue going out.
Yeah, really, it's a big deal. Today we're going to have with us Jerry White, who's a historic leader within the group, the campus-based ministry, the Navigators, which many of us are familiar with what used to be called Campus Crusade. It's now called Cru, and their key leader was Bill Bright. A lot of us have been involved with InterVarsity, which is also on universities. But then for Navigators, which is one of the key campus groups like this, Jerry White has been with them for 50 years, and he started basically in 1973. He's been the president emeritus since 2005 as far as internationally. This is a guy who sits on the board or the leadership group of the Lausanne movement. I mean, he's a key leader. But he wrote a book back in I think it would be in the 1970s, might have been the 80s, talking about modalities and sodalities. And a lot of this was coming out of a conversation that was started by a Protestant missiologist, Dr. Ralph Winter, who in 1973 put out a book called The Two Structures of God's Redemptive Mission. And in it, he talked a lot about churches, which are these modalities that we all go to and we've all been a part of. And churches being more and more dynamic is another real purpose of this podcast. And man, it's something to give your life to. But he identified also that there were this other structure called sodalities, which were the kind of groups that can get there before a church gets there. So Paul would go into Ephesus before the Ephesians church started. He would go into, you can go through Corinth before the Corinthians church started. And these small strategic teams, these like strike forces, these, what we would say, these teams or superheroic teams or leagues of superhero kind of teams, they would go in and miracles would happen, and they would really present the gospel of the kingdom through incarnation and through demonstration with power and through proclamation. And a miracle would happen and a church would be formed, which is the modality. Now, if you read the letters in the New Testament, you're reading sodality letters to modalities. So they had a role not only to help them start, they helped identify leaders. They got to places before churches could quite get there to even have a chance at it starting. And sometimes it didn't work. Most of the time it did. Always it was like a foundation for something in the future. But then they also were really strong in equipping and connecting those local churches. And so today you see a lot of churches that exist unto themselves. They don't go outside their doors. They don't really, they're senior leaders, whoever's popular sometimes or whoever's most marketable, but they're not necessarily submitted to anything outside themselves. And so in all reality, they've lost their connection to the power of the kingdom. So that's one side. Churches without sodalities, modalities without sodalities is difficult. But then the other cool thing is having teams like this can just be very powerful and electric. Groups like Navigators, Cru, InterVarsity, they function in this role as kind of being a temporary church for college students, that it serves its own function. It's like a outreach team on campuses to reach those guys, to hopefully send them back to their churches or on to starting churches or on to the marketplace where they'll be a part of their own churches. That's one kind. But then we've noticed within Boy the Ball's history that you can send these teams, like Boy the Ball teams, into a slum or into public schools or into a city. And there's such dynamic power that benefits churches in really dynamic ways. And we've been pointing back to the Abbey model with St. Patrick. And we've had some episodes talking about that, of just the way that these things work. And so this is a chance today to get to talk at this with a historic leader who's pushed this from a different side.
Yeah, I'm excited. It's it's an important conversation. It's one that we've been having we've had it for years on our end, being a sodality within Boy the Ball. One, like having being connected to modalities so that then the young people we're reaching have a place to go. Like the way we frame the conversation oftentimes has been the difference between, it's not like one is more superior than the other. It's the difference between a hospital and an ambulance. Mm-hmm. Like a hospital will take people and put them back together, but an ambulance goes out into the field and brings the person to a safe place. Yes. And that's kind of, for me, it's a helpful way of framing the conversation. If sodalities and modalities are new words for you, it's really just the functions of these different forms of ministry or ministry groups. There's the church, which is more of the function of a hospital, where it's a place for all of the people, and people get put back together and are restored, made whole. And then there's the sodalities, which are more apostolic teams, or the superheroic teams that we're talking about. So I think this is the beginning of a really big conversation. It's not going to be the only time we're talking about it, but it's a really important conversation.
Yeah, the connecting point is the kingdom. Like, if you develop great leaders within churches that are kingdom-centric, they're going to relate really, really well with these kingdom-centric leadership teams going out into the community. We had one time a leader, a friend of ours, say to us with Boy with the Ball, because our teams are positioned as nonprofits in a city, and yet we're reaching unreached people, even to be volunteers, and for sure in communities. But he said to us, because you're so kingdom-centric in everything, in every moment, in every movement, a lot of young people who would find church toxic right now, they come in and they so connect in with what you guys are doing. But by the time they've been with you for 6 months, 8 months, 12 months, 18 months, now the only place they could possibly fit into is a church. So when the kingdom is the common thread, it all works together. When the kingdom's not, you've got all sorts of stuff that happens. But I'm not so sure you have church. So there we go. And I think we're ready.
We're ready.
We're very, very excited today to have with us from Colorado Springs, Jerry White, who is the president emeritus with Navigators, was the international president from 86? Is that right, Jerry?
Right.
To 2005. And if you don't know of Navigators, Navigators is just one of the great and very dynamic campus ministries that, as students are away at college, really helps them kind of connect in with the faith experience as they're getting through school. But Jerry, we are just so glad to have you with us. For us, you're one of our heroes. You're a very historic leader, but really grateful to have you with us today.
Thank you. Well, good to be here, Jamie. And by the way, the Navs now only do about 20% campus. We're military, we're community, we're church, we're missions, a lot more than just the collegiate. And we're scattered. We're scattered with about 5,500 people in 112 countries across the world.
Well, that's pretty dynamic impact, which is what we are all after, any of us who are kingdom-minded. So one thought I had today, Jerry, is just a chance to get to know you a little bit, and then we're gonna talk a little bit about the subject of sodalities and modalities, or teams, strategic teams, and also, of course, local churches and how they play together. But Jerry, where'd you grow up? And basically, what was your pathway that got you to Navigators?
Well, let me give you a quick thumbnail, and I'll try to be quite brief.
Of course.
I was born in Iowa in a small town of 100 people, and my mother had me when she was 17. And then my father divorced her when I was just an infant. So I grew up in that small town, raised by my mother and my grandfather. My mother remarried when I was 8 years old, and we moved to Spokane, Washington. It was a traumatic move for me, leaving everything that I'd known. But it was of the Lord to go there, because a group of businessmen had started a Sunday school in our little neighborhood. And it was through that I came to Christ at about age 11. I gave it a great deal of thought, and this man, a businessman, helped me come find Christ. And then he remained in my life, essentially discipled me throughout my life. I'll cut it short, got very involved in high school and Youth for Christ and my church. Then to the University of Washington, where I studied electrical engineering, and that's where I met the Navigators. My first roommate had been led to Christ by the Navigators.
Wow.
So he started discipling me, taught me to have a quiet time, how to memorize scripture, and start studying the Bible. So that was my really first contact with the Navigators. But Navigators was a pretty small organization then. So that's how I met the Navigators. And then I went on to a career in the Air Force, and I'll continue with that if you'd like.
Well, I'd love to hear a little bit first before we go on to what happened after college on through your Air Force experience. But at that time, so Campus Crusade, now called Crew, Dr. Bright had started, I guess, on UCLA's campus, and that had already started. Navigators emerged later, InterVarsity and some other groups like that. But how did Navigators get started within that historic time?
Well, 1933, Dawson Trotman began working with sailors in Long Beach, California. And this was prior to World War II. And he started discipling them, helping them to know Christ, and then to just reach out on their ships or their stations. And he developed a lot of the early materials for the Navs, never expecting to start an organization. But by the end of World War II, we had navigator groups on about 1,000 ships and stations. So it was totally a military ministry.
Wow.
After World War II, all those veterans came out of the military, went to seminary, to college, to Bible schools, and began to reach out in their communities. And the Navigators then started helping them. A real turning point was when Billy Graham asked Dawson Trotman and the Navigators to design and lead their follow-up program.
Okay.
And so for several years, Dawson and his successor, Lawrence Sanney, gave 6 months out of the year designing follow-up for Billy Graham. But that also kind of put the Navigators on the map, so to speak, and went far beyond the military. Incidentally, you mentioned Bill Bright. Bill, on his first night as a non-believer in Southern California, stayed overnight in Dawson Trotman's home. And then when Bill came to Christ, we loaned him staff to help start the campus ministries. And so in a sense, we worked together in those early years.
That's great and really, really helpful. We, in the podcast, we've tried to kind of cover a lot of, the history of evangelism, specifically in the last few centuries in the U.S., and so that connects a lot of dots, even on some of the things that we were talking about. Okay, so then you end up getting out of college, and you've been involved with Navigators, but you go off into the military. So tell us a little bit about that pathway that ended up with you at Navigators.
Well, one thing you have to realize at that time, the Navigators were probably less than 100 staff.
Yes.
And so we didn't have a robust campus ministry at that time. That really developed in about 1960. But then I graduated in 59 from the University of Washington. Mary and I had been married. I was commissioned into the Air Force, went to fly and went through a number of assignments in pilot training. But God had a different plan. I can talk about that if we wish. And I ended up going into space. Wow. The Air Force sent me to Cape Canaveral as a young second lieutenant, and I became a mission controller in the early space program with the Air Force and NASA. During this time, I kept touch with the Navigators, but really wasn't around any Navigator staff. But the principle of evangelism, follow-up, and discipling had been communicated to me. And so I just did that and continued to keep touch with the Navigators. I'd planned to, since I wasn't going to fly, to get out of the Air Force, but God had a different plan for me. He really spoke to me while I was at Cape Canaveral and really gave me this message: stay in the Air Force, get a master's degree, go teach at the Air Force Academy, reach students, and get further training from the navigators who were located where the Air Force Academy was.
Wow.
I mean, that's quite a message.
Yeah.
And I had no idea how that was going to develop. And it was a rather miraculous journey on doing that. Ended up getting sent to Ethiopia by the Air Force for a short time. But then through a series of miracles, really, but due to time, I won't say exactly what all those were, but just God led in a miraculous way to get a master's degree and to come teach astronautics. I changed to the field of astronautics, space sciences, at the Air Force Academy. And before I had been at the academy for 48 hours, the chaplain called. Someone had told them I was coming in and asked if I would meet with students and to propose a Bible study. My predecessors and others who'd been there, the chaplain said, no, we don't need any help. But they did. Yeah. And the second day that I was in Colorado Springs, I met with 500 cadets and proposed a Bible study. And only 12 came, by the way.
Yeah.
But that began the Navigator ministry at the Air Force Academy.
Okay, so at that point, how did you get from that point? So you're there leading an individual Bible study that's got 12 coming at the Air Force Academy, and how do you get from that point to becoming the international president of Navigators?
Well, it's something I had nothing to do with, by the way. God orchestrated. But basically, I thought I was going to be a career officer, being a layman doing disciple making with the Navigators, but with my profession. And by the way, I believe greatly in the laymen as the primary ones who are called to the work of the gospel.
Mm-hmm. That's right.
So I went back. The Air Force asked me to go get a PhD. By this time, we'd seen dozens, if not 100 or so, cadets come to Christ. And so it was started having Bible studies in every squadron. I went off to Purdue and to work on a PhD in astronautics. And while I was there, I started the Navigator ministry at Purdue University.
Wow. Just
on the backhand. And then came back to the Air Force Academy to teach, continued to develop both my relationship to the Navigators. The Navigators brought me on their staff as a layman or an associate staff or whatever they called it at that time, at a grand salary of $1 a year, or maybe it might have been $1 a month. I don't remember. And so that was in '66. And then when I thought, well, now I'm in the Air Force, I'm going to be long-term as a layman in the Air Force and continue doing disciple making. Lawrence Sanny, then president of the Navigators, at about my 13-year point in the Air Force, asked if I would consider leaving the Air Force and coming full-time and helping with leadership in the Navigators. And we prayed and did that. So in 1973, I left active duty and stayed in the Air Force Reserves because I still had commitment to the Air Force. And long story beyond that, but how I ultimately became a major general in the Air Force Reserve. But that's a little later story. And so I went full-time with the Navigators, leading some regions. And for 10 years, I led 2 or 3 regions for the Navigators in the United States. One of which was the Pacific region, which brought me overseas a lot with the American military. I'd be in Korea and Okinawa and Hawaii and Japan, Philippines. And so I would always connect with the Navigator missionaries who were there. Then when I thought that would basically be my career with the Navigators, just leading a region, Lawrence Sanny asked if I would come to Colorado and be the COO of the Navigators International. He would still be president, but I would lead the field. And I did that in 1983. after about 3 years of that, Lauren walked into my office one day and said, I've been president for 30 years.
Wow.
That's enough. I'm going to step down, start the process of a selection. And so I was actually running the selection because we designed a process.
Yeah.
And about 2 months before that process was going to be activated, I realized, to my fear and fright, that I could be a candidate, and ultimately was selected to be international president of the Navigators at that time.
Wow. That's in every step of the journey, you're going forward, but you're never really going where you thought you would go.
Mm-hmm.
But it turns out pretty good.
Well, I call myself just absolutely unexpected directions. Every door I thought I was going through, God says, "Oh, by the way, I've got another door I'd like you to go through." And even when I thought I was through with the Air Force forever, God led me to stay in the Air Force Reserves and continued on with a career there.
There's some other huge pieces that if you listen to your story, first of all, there's a lot of strategy to it. Like there's a lot of strategic leadership and perspective, even not from you. I mean, even those business leaders, doing the Sunday school in the neighborhood, that it's of course no wonder you think of outreach outside churches. You were reached by outreach that was in neighborhoods outside churches.
That's right.
So all along your story, you see the seeds of the things you've given yourself to. It's the continuity of God. You couldn't have arranged all those things. But then also the focus that all along has been central to Navigators that also you've given your life to, of evangelism, follow-up, and discipleship. Those right. pieces being really central to you. And do you feel like those were just central to Navigators and you absorbed them? Or do you feel like they were things that God just put in your life and as you've turned into what Jesus did, it's just building blocks of kingdom work?
Well, certainly the Navigators planted that idea in my mind. The churches I was in, did not especially emphasize discipleship. They emphasized evangelism and missions. I mean, those are the two big things in the churches I was in. And I had wonderful pastors, by the way. I've had delightful experiences in churches. My wife is the daughter of a pastor, and we've always had close connections with churches. The one I'm in now, I've been in for decades. But discipleship at that time was not central. It is to a lot of churches now. I think the Navigators, most historians would say, credit the Navigators with introducing the concept of follow-up and Navigators to the church, and then discipleship to the church.
Yeah.
And so did God put it on my heart first? No, I think people built it in as they shared into my life and as I was being discipled. By the way, the key is not just discipling, it's disciple making and producing other disciple makers so that there's a multiplication effect.
You are really dangerous for me and Christine to be around because things we give ourselves to in meetings that we feel like, aha.
Disciples who make disciples who make disciples who make disciples.
Yeah, and we really feel like we figured something out ourselves, and then you explain that it's been happening for hundreds of years.
But it isn't. I mean, it's the Lord speaks.
We're not wrong. Is nice, Christine. But I would love you to just. I know this is slightly out of the narrative of what we're in right here, but I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. So churches for many years now focus on discipling. And then you saying that it's not even just discipleship, but it's disciple making who, produce disciples. First of all, it's kind of amazing that we've all survived without that. But as you've seen in seasons where it wasn't influenced, but as you've seen that released, and specifically across the world in your work internationally with Navigators, as you've seen that really focus, what are some of the things in your heart that make it very beautiful to you, very powerful, and why it should be reinforced over and over again?
Well, first of all, disciple making was on Jesus' heart. Why didn't he reach multitudes? He reached 12. And the 12 began to reproduce.
Mm-hmm.
And then Paul in 2 Timothy 2:2, he reaches Timothy, who reaches others and other faithful men. Paul always built in the lives of people, men and women, and then commissioned them and trained them to do exactly the same thing. That's the incredible multiplication effect, geometric progression, if you will, from a mathematician's viewpoint, to reach the world. You supposedly, if you do that little chess piece, 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, we should reach the world in about 16 years. What happens? People get wounded along the way and don't reproduce. They get crippled in the battle and don't continue to make disciples and do evangelism.
Well, that's very powerful stuff. The truth with you that it's hard to be around you a little bit, because we really could take. There's part of me that would want to just film talking to you for about 100 hours, because it's very much right. I think sometimes too, Jerry, we've seen where it's not just that some leaders get wounded, but it's also sometimes some of those leaders aren't really good at handing it over to a next group of leaders.
Right.
And so they're pretty good at making disciples. They're not good at always making disciples who make disciples in that way that keeps
That's
going.
right.
And we've had some restarts there organizationally. Well, I want to, we can kind of keep going with this conversation, and Christine will jump in with questions, but I want to make the final turn just so that we're good that we're good managers of the time here. But along the way, we were talking before you came on, just of that we all know very, very clearly that the body of Christ, the church, it is central. It's absolutely beautiful, and we're right to say that. But Jesus's message was really the kingdom, and seek first the kingdom. And church really is most church when it's revolving around the kingdom, and not trying to be bigger than the kingdom, which would be impossible. But your point along the way is that, and a lot of this echoes some of the stuff that Dr. Ralph Winter started talking about in the 70s, is that there really are two kingdom structures that are really powerfully involved in mission. And one is modalities, these local churches, these groups that have been reached and are growing and are reaching out in their local situation. But you caught on to the fact, and it's in a lot of your story and of course the Navigator's history, that there could also be these modern versions of kind of Paul's missionary bands or Jesus's own group, these sodalities or these strategic kind of outreach efforts. And so how'd you come to that, apart from just your own experiences? And then how does that play out today, Jerry? It would be our big question for you.
Well, Ralph Winter, by the way, lived in Lawrence Sandy's home and was discipled by the Navigators. And so Ralph has been a close friend through the years until the Lord took him home. And I'm still in touch with his son-in-law through the Lausanne movement and some other things, which I'm quite involved in the Lausanne movement. But specifically, there's always been a tension between the local and what we have come to call parachurch movements. It probably should be called para-local church movements. And there are two kinds. There are local parachurch movements, the rescue missions, the things like FCA and reaching into high schools. A local church is very limited in its outreach. It's rather circumscribed both demographically and geographically. Now, that's why we have 100 churches in Colorado Springs or more. And they're all doing little things, but they're not doing it together. And they don't have the same vision. They're all good. They are wonderful bodies of Christ, and people often enter the kingdom through coming to a church or through members in a church. But we've always found that there are demographics that the church simply doesn't touch. And then you talk about missions. sending missions. Every mission sending agency is a parachurch organization. Back from the China Inland Mission to England and the Propagation for the Gospel, Society for the Propagation of the Gospel. So sometime in the early 70s, Joe Aldrich, who was president of Multnomah School of the Bible, came to me, and he'd been a friend for years, and said, Jerry, we want you to do this book on the church and the parachurch. And I said, you got to be crazy. Why would somebody want me to write a book that nobody likes? So that was the conversation I was having with Joe. And I'd never written a book. Well, I'd written one, I guess, before that. I'd written a text on astrodynamics, if that interests you. It's got all kinds of symbols and things. But Joe said, well, we need you to present both sides. And so I did that. And it had a good reception and a mix on. Some people liked it, some didn't. Some who are extremely pro-choice would say the only thing is the local church, and that all mission agencies ought to be under the authority and control of the local church. Now, that worked a little bit in the more Baptistic orientations where local churches were independent. But as soon as they started forming a mission agency, they themselves became parachurch.
Yes.
And a denomination is a parachurch structure.
Yes.
But that, you say that to some groups of pastors and they say, well, no, it's still under the church. But if you go into the whole concept beyond local and mobile to the concept of apostolic outreach,
yes,
there were apostles, and the apostles were the missionaries. They were ones who went out and pioneered new works in Ephesus and Galatia and all over the world. And so really the history of missions is a history both of mobile and apostolic. That is, people who had a vision on their heart went out and started something new. It may or may not look like what came out of England or Germany or America. And so the way the church early on grappled with that was, well, if they plant another local church, that's fine. But that itself becomes limited in its locality. And even that has to reach out, for instance, in Nigeria and Kenya and Ethiopia and other places with refugees. Who's going to reach the refugees? Others are going to have to do that. So if you look at it from a kingdom perspective, a missionary perspective, when Christ came into the earth, he says, I'm going to build my kingdom. And when he says the church, ecclesia, it meant both local and mobile, all part of the church. So a church is not just defined by a boundary of a geography and a group of leadership, but it's much bigger than that. Mm-hmm. But because of our lack of breadth as a human being, we put things in structures. You do it with the boys with the ball. I do it with the navigators. My church does it within my church context. But we're always sending out apostles and new things that grow up and become something where they are, always through evangelism and teaching and discipleship. So I've gone on long enough on that, but does that give you the picture of where I had to deal with some of that?
It does. And it was, you're very passionate about it and then very informed. So mm-hmm. It's kind of fun. And you're distilling it really succinctly for us, which is great. So we've kept Christine back here a little bit and she's a fireball. So, obviously the kind of things that we think about as you hear about this is, okay, what does that look like today mm-hmm. as it's happening? But what other thoughts did you have, Christine?
No, I think this is wonderful. I have so many notes that are going to take me to a lot of different places. So first, thanks for your time today. This is really wonderful. I guess a question I have, and it's multifold, but if we look at the role Paul and the apostles played in the early church, specifically if we're looking at like Ephesus or Corinth, and the letters to the church, even like he wasn't submitted to the local church. They were out, and they were missionaries. They were evangelizing. They were actually planting churches, and then he was writing letters to the church, and the churches were actually more submitted to the apostolic authority. Do you think that's a little inverted now in today's church, where even as you were what I understood as you were talking is the local church probably has had some overreach where it's just tried to control a lot of missions, and so then
I lost you.
Like a lot of missions or apostolic works end up
There
sometimes.
you came back.
Oh, sorry. Can you hear me?
Yeah, now I hear you. I missed a portion of the end of your question.
Okay. My question is, do you believe that some of the works of the apostolic works or the missions work is a little inverted now in today's church, where it's hidden within a local church context or kind of buried within versus being more outward centered? Because that's kind of what I've seen in some different churches, or some of what we've encountered as we're working with churches or different groups, even like our local boy the ball teams that are more apostolic work. Sometimes if they get too embedded in a local church that isn't healthy, then it almost snuffs the apostolic work because it's just too overwhelming for that local church context.
Starts to absorb it.
It starts to absorb it, and then it limits the work of that apostolic team. So do you think we've gotten a little inverted in today's church, or what would you say to a group that, whether it be a local church that's trying to be more intentionally outward focused beyond its local context and has like a group of apostolically gifted leaders around? Is that too much of a loaded question?
How does it play together?
Yeah, how does it play together, and what would you say to a group that's trying to figure that out?
Well, it's inevitable that things will become embedded locally.
Yeah.
I mean, that's what you want, because you want people to be engaged in a local church. You want the fruit of the ministry needs to go there, but it doesn't stay there. The sign of a healthy church is that it is spawning other movements.
Yeah.
Whether it be Boys with the Ball or Navigators or whatever. They may not have the same name, but they need to have the same vision.
Yeah.
When something gets put inside a church and sort of locked there, so to speak, it'll do good works. But if it doesn't go outside and connect elsewhere, then it soon kind of dies out. Just like a Sunday school class that starts great, and pretty soon everybody grows up and goes somewhere else, and the thing disappears. Youth movements are particularly fragile in that regard because people grow through it.
Yeah,
they become adults, and they go elsewhere. And they may or may not do what they did when they were youth.
Yes.
And so I feel that the church and organizations that are essentially constituted outside the authority and boundary of local churches, which would be most of the parachurch movements, by the way, that they are a necessary yeast to the whole of the kingdom of God, and they have a mission, because they will reach where a local church will not reach. They don't supplant it, but they reach beyond. And so whenever we're going out beyond the demographic boundaries or geographic boundaries of a church, you've got to have another structure. And now the mega churches have tried to solve this by being sending agencies of their own. But the mega church, that's another topic, is a phenomenon of the last few decades. And history will tell how long they last. Most of the good ones but purposely divide off into other local assemblies. A few try to keep everything under one roof, which becomes almost unmanageable. But no, I think it needs to go out and beyond. With what another word we could use for sodality, is specialist agencies.
Yeah.
And so they reach out, they provide a specialty and a concept and a vision that would be just a small cog in a local church, but which are major to what you're doing.
Yes.
Another question I have, I don't know if you have, I told you I have way too many questions.
Go ahead.
And this may be too spicy for this conversation, so you guys can shut it down. I've already prefaced it with you, Jamie, so you've heard it. But what role do you think the denominational church has played in some of the because I think, let me backtrack. I really love what you just said about mega churches and how they try to just do all of it. And that doesn't totally work. And I love that you highlighted that it's a phenomenon of the last little bit. But I feel like the denominational church has done that a little bit as well, because churches need some vision and direction. And that historically, if you're looking at the early church, came from Paul and the apostolic bands and those missionary teams. But now it's in the last several centuries has come from denominations. The larger denomination is deciding mission or vision. So again, it's coming from a very inverted centric group that is trying to just be outward focused within the context that's relevant to them. So it's a local church trying to be very relevant outward. So again, kind of cutting out some of these specialist teams. So what role do you think, or how do you think we could correct that other than just unleashing these specialist teams?
Let me adjust that and then give you this exact same question. How do we make adjustments? How do we get both of these to play together? It is interesting that the early church, Christine, Paul is very submitted to the group at Antioch that he sent from, which is a church. And then he's very submitted to the group at Jerusalem. So within kingdom, there's this mutual accountability and submission to Jesus the King and what seems right to him. So it gets a little iffy if we get too far any one direction. Sure. And then as the apostles die off, then it's the Roman Catholic authority that's central for 1,500 years almost, until then you end up with those denominations. So, and in each age, it's hard to look backwards, but they were doing the best that they could. So I guess the thing, Jerry, that I would take your question is to say, this is probably our final comment on this, but what would be your best encouragements to local churches and local teams or groups like this to try to work together in this age?
Well, first of all, denominations are a relatively new thing. The last 200 years, perhaps. And really, what are they? They're just groupings of people of like doctrine and practice who decide to band together for better expansion, both for missionary sending as well as local development. Whether it be the Southern Baptist Church or the Evangelical Free or the various Episcopal branches, they band together so that they could cooperate to send people out, whether to make new churches locally, that is in a nation, or to send missionaries outward. Now, most of them do one thing well, that is you plant churches, and they have kind of methodology, and there are a lot of people that have written about this. But the specialist agencies learn how to work with people. They learn how to work with different kinds of emphases, like we do initially with students, because they're a transient group, or you do with boys of the ball. Whether it be in a neighborhood in an inner city, or in a rural area out in Kenya, or wherever it may be, you're providing a vehicle and a vision that is different than just planning a local church. Now, could that be criticized? Sure, it could. Now, for instance, we in the Navigators are not local church planners, but I will tell you that in some Hindu contexts and some Muslim contexts, we essentially are planting a local church.
Mm-hmm.
It just doesn't look like it.
Sure.
It doesn't have that taste and feel.
Yeah.
And once you plant a local church, the distinctive of local churches is multi-generational. It's grandma, grandpa, uncle, aunts, unsaved, saved, kids, disabled people. I mean, it's got to be a very accepted thing. Whereas we in the Navigators and many parachurch organizations are pretty specialized on who we let inside the door and who we bring inside the door.
Yeah.
And so we just need to understand there's a place for both.
Yes.
And never put down one or the other.
Yeah.
And look how we integrate at least at the edges. Perhaps not at the center, but integrate at the edges.
Well, we integrate at the edges. You've had a few. I also liked these specialist groups are a necessary yeast. Mm-hmm. That was a really great statement as well. Well, Jerry, I think what's happening with Christine is she's wanting to sit and learn and grow and pull stuff out of you, which you've been really, really generous with your time today. I understand you could have been talking to one of the higher level leaders of the U.S. Air Force Academy, but instead you're talking to us. But one parting shot is just, I know you're deeply involved in the Lausanne movement as we get ready for this year. They're convening in South Korea, but that's
24,
in 24. That's right, next year. So that's a really exciting. You've gone from NASA, where you're going into space, back down into regional leadership with Navigators, then international, and now you're dealing with global with Lausanne. But what do you see happening with Lausanne as we finish here, and what are some exciting things for people to know about with Lausanne?
Well, first of all, exciting. The idea of Lausanne is to connect leaders and ideas internationally. And we want to help people know one another and to collaborate when they can. We always, over periods of time, become rather cylinders. We're just silos in where we work. And Lausanne is a place to not only stimulate new ideas. For instance, Ralph Winter really developed some of the modalities, sodality in the context of a Lausanne environment.
Yeah.
And in '89, we brought together the charismatic, non-charismatic groupings. In Cape Town 2010, we brought leaders that started working together. For instance, the translation community decided to cooperate and collaborate so that they weren't doing the same thing in the same place and really divide up the pie, so to speak. So the function of Lausanne is to really stimulate leaders to know one another, to keep the kingdom focus, to keep an outward focus for the gospel for the world, and that what we're doing is really global, but with local expressions. And the gathering in Korea in 2024, which will have about 5,000 on site, 10,000 online, and perhaps several thousand more scattered about in other kinds of groups, is to stimulate, connect, and help people move forward together in collaboration.
Well, it's exciting stuff. We're obviously in a time where some people can become a little bit involved in navel gazing and feel like they might be losing in their local situation. But I think whenever we pull our heads up out of looking down and maybe even away from the evening news, we just recognize that this is a very dynamic and exciting hour of what Jesus is doing and what the Holy Spirit is doing across the globe. And so it's really a time of celebration. And like you said, a time of stimulation and connection and collaboration. So you've got to be encouraged from where you sit.
I'm very encouraged. Every movement is always fragile. it's only as good as the net last year and so forth. So is a church, by the way. The church, though, often has a structure that keeps a building. But like my home church that I grew up in Spokane, Washington, disappeared.
Yeah.
And it's no more. And other churches, the same. And organizations have come and gone.
Sure.
But while we're here, we need to be as vital as we can doing the mission that God has given us, and then always keeping our eyes out to where there is a collaboration that will build the kingdom of God. But never lose the central vision God has called you to. That's the key.
Well, that's a great way to end our time together. So, Jerry, thank you so much for taking some time with us today.
Great to be with you, Jamie and Christine. Thank you. And we can do it again if you want to talk some more.
Oh, that sounds great.
Love it.
All right, Christine, I find myself preparing for this final segment here with fear and trepidation.
Sorry, I went a little wild.
Well, we're both on vacation, and so here we go. But obviously, you took so many notes that at one point, I don't know if people could see this, but your computer was smoking. What? I feel like feels like a grenade with a pin. What are you thinking, Christine?
So many things. Yeah. I think I think so. Like everything he was saying for me is a little bit like a fire hose, not in a bad way where it's just so much. Some key things that stood out for me, I'll just hit some bullet points. One, a really interesting thing is those strategic teams or specialist teams or parachurches or apostolic teams, sodalities, whatever you want to call them, are a necessary yeast. If you really want to like unpack that, that's like a whole conversation. Because like yeast is a fungi, which fungi is kind of gross to a lot of people, but it's a very necessary ingredient to make really delicious things. Like you can't make bread. You can't make cinnamon rolls. You can't do, it's something that is really necessary and a part of life. But alone can be a little weird. So that's just really interesting.
Stop looking at me when you say it can be a little weird. But go ahead. I agree with you. Necessary yeast. That was a cool statement he made.
Yeah. But then what I was trying to get at is with the questions I was asking him, as we've been talking about, because he probably didn't have context. He didn't have context for our previous conversations of just, we're in search of this group of churches, like that 30% of churches that have really figured something out. Churches
that would see themselves as missional, because that's the popular term.
Yeah, because our whole conversation here is around growing leaders. It's reaching the next generation, because we've had this is episode 20-something. We've had several conversations with young leaders, marketplace leaders, missional leaders in the church and outside of the church, really highlighting the fact that there has been an exodus of young people leaving the church. So how do we reach the next generation? It's really the entire purpose of this podcast.
Yeah.
And so the mass exodus being partially, not entirely, partially it's young people's bad attitudes and wanting to be right. Sure. But partially there's a breakdown in the missional church, in the church that's keeping them from being missional. And so we're investigating where is that to then help leaders, if they're interested, find traction with young leaders.
Yep. Just keep going for your next point. So please remember, we spend like every Wednesday afternoon just reaching out and trying to connect in the major cities across the world with the top missional churches. So if you know of a missional church, either in the comments down below, or you can email us at info@boywiththeball.com. Any way you want to get a hold of us, we're just trying to connect with those churches. We just had a great Love Your City conference with a lot of great missional churches like Covenant Life Church here in Lawrenceville, Georgia, but also Perimeter Church over in Johns Creek, and we had several others. But man, for next year's conference, we'd obviously love to have many more, but we just are getting a hold of these leaders. We'll have them on the podcast, but these are the innovators. These are the great ideas. These are churches that are figuring it out. And I just think those stories, to what you're saying, are critical to tell. Keep going.
Yeah, so for me, I'm trying to, in the questions I was asking, figure out where some of the breakdowns may have happened or have been, so we can then, as missional leaders, correct some of those breakdowns to then find traction with young leaders. And so I have nothing against let me preface this, and I think I said this with the episode with Alan Hoskins, against the denominational church. But it is not a secret that several denominational churches are starting to break down because they're in conflict internally with themselves. But again, as you start focusing so much internally, you lose relevance externally. And so that was part of where some of my questioning was coming, where it's just like, how do we, as the big C church, denominationally, non-denominationally, however, get outside of ourselves to then find relevance with young leaders and with the lost or the people who don't know him. And it seems like, from what I have seen in my experience, both as a young leader myself, having been reached by a group that wasn't solely connected, but not within just a church context. It was a more specialist apostolic team. How do we find ways to maintain relevance and impact? Because I am a leader in my church, and that's what I want for my church, is to be a great local church, but then also to be a great developer and sending agent of leaders that are cultivating more young people and more leaders locally, regionally, nationally, globally. And so I found this conversation very, very helpful. I think there's a lot to unpack, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts.
Yeah, so I mean, you're looking at, after the conversation with Alan Hoskin and what we're seeing right now as far as denominational churches, and you're focusing there. Jerry was really, I thought, poking a little in an interesting way towards the mega churches, and I as an elder and a associate pastor at the church that you go to, where you're also a leader, I could just say that non-denominational churches have faced a different version of the same thing. And I think it's this. It's when the body of Christ is disconnected from the head, and the head being Jesus, it just struggles. And so what we want to do is we want to create a structure. We want to create a really powerful organizational way that ensures that that will happen. And as the churches or modalities relate to the sodalities and or the strategic teams or specialist teams, or vice versa. And I really think the truth is what you really see is when both church leaders and churches and both these outreach teams and their leaders, where they're fully submitted to Jesus and fully following him, allowing their lives to be crucified in the way that it was before and now risen up with Jesus to be in him and for him and following him, great things happen. So I think if you can get churches that are submitted to Jesus and him being the lordship of the way their church grows and runs, which would of course involve being missional and of course being those things, that's a huge start. And when you get these local teams allowed to exist and then growing out into these really unique strike force-like situations, those two things are incredible. But then the final piece is less about government than more about just a natural outflow of integrity on both these sides will be integration. That the two will play together because they have the same head. The hand won't say to the foot, I have no need of you, but they'll work together. And so this is a hard conversation to have because most people within churches just don't even understand or see or touch in a living way these kind of teams or these kind of outreach efforts. And many are inside churches where even within their churches, they don't even see missional outreach or any of that kind of impact. So it's almost, you were saying inverted, it's just dead. And of course, we're just watching that those things are just passing away. But we're so excited to meet these 30%ers, these groups that are growing, that it has to be that they're creatively and dynamically connected to Jesus, and he's leading them into creative, dynamic work, but then also seeing the way that these teams integrate and work together with it, that it could be awesome. So the hard part is that everything I just said and everything you kind of just said, and really a lot of what Jerry said, it's not in people's frame of, it's not what they're seeing or thinking about. And so, but it is in the book of Acts. And so we just really need to do what in every age is the beginning of great movements, is we have to protest and we have to push people back to the evangels or the gospels and the way it was with Jesus, where he had the teams, and then churches weren't quite started yet. You just had his team and even John the Baptist team. But then into the book of Acts about what it looks like. And then it just gets very exciting. And And there are historical contexts for this. Mm-hmm. But it is fragile. That's the thing Jerry said too, is movements are fragile. It's the last set of defining leaders and it's the last year that determines whether it keeps going. So I'm just saying, I don't think it's just denominational churches. I don't think it's just mega churches. I don't think it's just the other non-denominational churches. I think it's that this is an old thought, old way that is just forgotten.
It is. I'm going in so many directions. I think it's the script we're using is a relatively new script. Yes. It's not the script from the Book of Acts. It is the script of the last probably 50 to 100 years that a lot of people are using, and it is the script of what Jerry was going after in some of the mega churches, where it's just like a group that can do everything. So if the church, quote unquote, can just do everything, then we're golden. But actually, like, you don't want a church that does everything. It's kind of like Walmart doesn't produce the best clothes. They produce a little bit of everything, but it's not like the best jeans you're going to find.
You're picking a fight with my wife, Kathy, in this moment.
Like, Levi's only really makes denim. Yeah. They make excellent denim. So why, like, the church should not try to just be excellent at everything. And so...
Well, I'm going to interrupt you just slightly to say, when you listen to what you just heard Jerry said, even though that's our narrative, that's not even what's happened in the last 100 years. Right. Like, he just explained all these different groups that participated in getting us to where we are today. So even though that might be what we all think about, because these days we come to churches as consumers, we hear the story of that, this is the most amazing place, most beautiful music, that was an incredible message, and it's us, us, us. But it's actually a slightly delusional narrative that's sunk in. That's not even the historically true.
No, I agree with you. That was one of the things he highlighted was it's where mega churches get caught up, is they just try to do everything. I was like, and that's actually where a lot of churches are just trying to reproduce what mega churches have done, but it's not even totally working. And so then I think the conversation, I think this is the beginning of the conversation, but it's what works should be the question. And then how do we do what works? And I think it even goes back to your very first statement where it's like, seek first the kingdom, yes, not seek first the church. And that's where we get caught up, is we try to build the church, but we lose Jesus in it.
Yeah, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. And we're missing that. We're missing that in a big way. And I'd say that to any of you that are listening to this, if you're offended by anything you're touching, it just, if you don't get that first button on the shirt right, none of the other buttons go well. But the other piece is that humility, the broken and the contrite, humble yourself in the sight of the Lord and he will lift you up. Humility is a big thing to the Lord. And humility is really just sanity. If you get into delusions of grandeur, it's really, really nice to be broken free from those delusions, because you're crazy. And so we're dying right now, and we're missing our kids because we're acting crazy. And so once again, we've said this several times on this podcast, stop it. Just stop it. Get over yourself.
Snap out of it. Don't be weird.
Don't be weird is right. All right, that's enough for today.
Thanks for listening.
Thanks.
Sorry if we freaked you out.